Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 ConQast video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today I'm pleased to present you with still another installment in my continuing series of Community Spotlight videos, in which I interview various prominent and upstanding members of the Conquest LCG community. In the past, we discussed guests' favorite decks and how best to pilot their preference of Warlord. But now that I've completed an initial interview and guest analysis for each of our first 14 Warlords, I now look to assess and explore the thus far strictly pre-released Warlords of the upcoming The Great Devourer deluxe expansion. So, expect a discussion that's largely based on experience, but still contains some speculation and theory, but hopefully through guests sharing their initial impressions, their very first experiences, all within the context of hundreds of previous pre-Tyranid games worth of experience. They'll be able to provide you with a wealth of information useful to both new and veteran players alike. If you enjoyed this video, remember to hit the like button, ensure you're subscribed, and you're encouraged to share, because the more engagement this content receives, the more viewers are reached, and ever the broader you help grow our ConQuest community. But with our introduction aside, let's get things started with a discussion of our upcoming The Swarmlord. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, but before I ask you about the Termagant token birds and the bees, why don't you introduce yourself and let our viewers know how you're involved in the Conquest LCG community.
I'm Davis Kingsley. I go by Kingsley on CardGameDB and Big Bailey Girelli on Octagon. I'm one of the co-hosts of the Warhammer ConQast podcast, and I'm generally a cool guy.
Sure. Well, I definitely appreciate your coming back on here, just so that we get the lavishing heaps of praise and admiration on you out of the way. To talk you up a little bit, you were the second place at the 2014 Conquest World Championships. You recently scored top 4 with the North American Championship, so pretty stellar player, widely regarded as one of the best in our community, so I very much appreciate your coming on here today. And this is actually one of the final community spotlight videos I wanted to do. So far I've covered all the different Warlords of the core set, the Warlord cycle, and even though the Great Devourer has yet to hit store shelves, I've yet to purchase it myself, we've still one last Warlord to cover, and that is the Swarmlord. So, what is there that stands out about him? Why would a player want to select the Swarmlord?
Yeah, so I think there's really two different things there. The first thing is why a player would want to select the Tyranids, and the second thing is why they would want to play the Swarmlord in particular. Real briefly, the Tyranids are quite unlike the other factions in the game. They have very different rules. They can't use a lot of the neutral cards that other factions can. They can only use neutral non-units, so you're not going to see the staple cards like Void Pirate or Rogue Trader.
Right.
And they can't have any alliances, so you're not going to see any cards from other factions in a Tyranids deck. But what the Tyranids do get you is they have a Synapse unit, which is like a mini Warlord that you start out with, and is extremely powerful. And then they have a bunch of crazy stuff in their own faction. A lot of factions' elite units are vehicles and can't take attachments, but the Tyranid elite units can take whatever attachments you want, so you can combo their attachments with even their biggest units and create like giant powerhouses. You can do a bunch of crazy things, and that Synapse gives you a kind of unparalleled level of control and decision-making for each turn. The other cool thing about the Tyranids is that if you want to get into the game and you're a new player, you can buy one core set and one Great Devourer box once Great Devourer hits stores, and you'll be good to go for competitive play. So that's actually something that I think people have not talked about that much, but strikes me as like really impressive. It makes Conquest the easiest of the LCGs to get into from a competitive level, as long as you're interested in Tyranids.
Sure, and I mean, I definitely think you hit on a fantastic point when you do say competitive. Certainly, players have not been complaining about a lack of Tyranid strength out the gate. And just taking a look at Paul Steiner's games results statistical database, we can see statistically that the Swarmlord and Old One Eye both have a pretty reasonable showing out the gate in regard to their competitive status.
Yeah, so I just took a look at that myself before this interview, and I think right now Old One Eye is number one. Hackmaster Kith, the Dark Eldar Warlord from the core set, is number two, and the Swarmlord is currently number three. Though the Old One Eye and the Swarmlord don't have that many games played with them, so the margins of error are still high there. Nevertheless, it's a very impressive early showing.
Definitely. I suppose specifically, why would a player perhaps want to choose the Swarmlord over Old One Eye if they do have that predilection for the Tyranid faction?
Yeah, so I've been playing the Swarmlord over Old One Eye more recently. I think that the main thing that the Swarmlord has going for you is that he's just like his ability is extremely strong as the game goes on, and his entire signature squad is pretty great. And I think that Old One Eye has a very strong ability in the early game, but it becomes less relevant as the game goes later on.
Sure.
Whereas the Swarmlord is kind of the reverse, where you have an ability that doesn't necessarily do all that much in the early game, but in the late game you can potentially amass an extremely frightening army. If you're playing a hive mind oriented deck with the Swarmlord, your late game army is more or less as strong as anything I've ever seen, probably stronger. Like I've had games where, I have a bunch of hive mind units on the key planet. I have like 4 or 5 Termagants. I have Termagant hordes making new Termagants every turn. All the Termagants are like, 3/3 or something like that because of all the hive mind support. It becomes extremely hard for people to deal with late game. Um, the other thing that I like about the Swarmlord is that he has the ability to play the card Clogged with Corpses very effectively.
Right.
And it seems strange to be interested in a Warlord only for one card, but Clogged with Corpses is one of the best cards in the game right now because there's every support card in the every support destruction or counter support card in the core set and the initial Warlord cycle is, in my opinion, overpriced by one resource. Which is to say, I think Squig Bombing should cost 1. I think Calculated Strike should cost 0. I think that the Orc guy, the Luda guys, should cost 3, and so on. Clogged with Corpses is priced really competitively in that it costs 0, and it does have a cost of causing you to have to sacrifice Termagant tokens, but you're getting those Termagant tokens for free with your Warlord, so that's not that much of a cost, and in some cases it can even be to your advantage. So I think the Swarmlord has a better ability to use that. I think he has a somewhat better signature squad, and I think he's not as focused on early aggression as Old One Eye.
Sure.
So I think that all in all, I like the Swarmlord. I like the Swarmlord's ability to kind of stay relevant and stay dangerous into the late game. Whereas I think that Old One Eye's ability starts to be less relevant as the game goes on, and you don't an enemy can easily focus you down in one turn, for instance. It's really good in early fights where it's not that possible to do all that much damage, but later it becomes somewhat dangerous to do.
Right. I definitely think once you start seeing a large accumulation of resources, once some of those later game units start hitting the battlefield, it becomes pretty easy, if not trivial, to outpace Old One Eye's regeneration. Whereas if you've had plenty of time to start amassing hive mind specialization units, then the Swarmlord is standing to be all the stronger.
Yeah.
You talk specifically about, say, Clogged with Corpses being beneficial, in a sense, destroying your tokens. And I'm envisioning, like, if you start approaching that cap, you can destroy some of those tokens and redistribute them, in a sense, by creating additional ones. How often is it that you approach that token limit?
It depends on what deck I'm playing. So I have 2 main builds with the Swarmlord that I've been playing recently. One of them has a lot of hive mind units and is very much sort of conventional. We're going to make a bunch of tokens and they're going to get buffed by the hive mind units and we're going to have a super crazy late game army. That deck hits the token cap pretty frequently because not in addition to the Swarmlords, 1 or 2 tokens per turn, I have Spawn Termagants, which under normal circumstances will create 4 or 5 tokens.
Right.
I have the Termagant Hordes, which will create 1 for every combat round at the planet where they're at. So that will quite frequently create, somewhere between 1 and 3 tokens in a turn. And in that situation, if you've played that Spawn Termagants earlier and you have a few tokens on the late planets that aren't going to be relevant too soon, and you want to get more tokens out there, you can use Clogged with Corpses to get rid of them. But the more common situation where I found that to be really good is with Planet Taurus, which is the planet that allows the victor there to trigger the battle ability and either gain 3 resources or draw 3 cards if they have fewer units.
Right.
So the Swarmlord normally doesn't like this planet very much because not only do you start out with an extra unit thanks to your Synapse, but you also make 2 units every turn. There are a lot of situations where you might want to voluntarily not trigger your reaction in order to prevent the opponent from having fewer units than you to trigger Taurus. But one trick that I found is that, so Clogged with Corpses says that you sacrifice X Termagant units to destroy a support with printed cost X or lower.
Right.
So you can actually kill as many Termagants as you want if you need to bleed off some guys on later planets or even on earlier planets in order to prevent that Taurus trigger. And as a bonus, you can also blow up someone's support, which is frequently quite good. That's a little bit matchup dependent, but Ragnar Blackmane aside, almost every deck has either supports in it or like a signature support that they want to play, and even Ragnar frequently plays Catachan Outpost and so on.
Well, certainly, and it certainly seems as though you've gotten quite a bit of practice thus far with the Tyranids under your belt, just considering that there's such a unique faction, the 8th faction, to be added to this game. What was your initial approach trying to get that first bit of experience and ultimately, start moving along the path of mastery?
Yeah, so the first thing that I did when I was playing the Tyranids is I just threw together all the cards that instinctively looked good to me initially, and just started playing some games just with all that stuff jammed together. And, these weren't necessarily decks that were very synergistic or sophisticated. It was more like, if I think a card is good or potentially good, I'm going to play 2 or 3 copies just so that I can get that card out and see how it's actually going to do.
Right.
And then based on those results, I sort of refined it and started having, the early deck had a lot of cards with 2 copies, ones that I wasn't so sure about. And, some of those got reduced and some of those got bumped up to 3 copies after a bunch of testing. An example of that is the card Regeneration. I was initially playing 1 or 2 copies. I'm now at 3 in most decks because I found that it was really good in testing. But by the same token, I initially thought that the Heavy Venom Cannon would be very strong, and I was playing 2 copies of that, and I've cut to 1 or 0 copies of that in most decks because the effect is just not really what I thought it was going to be. And I think it's useful to spend an initial period basically running anything that you think is good or even might be good just to test out a lot of different things, and then sort of refine your deck by taking those themes and those cards that have proven to be more effective.
Well, I mean, that definitely sounds like a logical approach to me. I suppose at the present moment, considering the Swarmlord in particular, what do you feel some of his greatest strengths are as a warlord? Like, what exactly does he do best?
Yeah, so I think the greatest strength of the Swarmlord is that you're basically creating a bunch of units that your opponent is going to have to deal with at some point. And depending on how you're managing your commitments, you can conceivably build up quite a large force. And you're basically getting these completely for free. So the momentum in the long game is kind of with you because you're building this stuff up. And additionally, your signature squad is extremely strong. The Brood Warriors can be like a de facto another 2-cost 2-command unit, which the Tyranids only have 1 of. And they can sometimes be even better than that in situations where you have more Termagants than just 1 on a planet. But so the Swarmlord himself has a strong ability that like builds up towards the late game. But additionally, his signature squad really patches some of the holes in the Tyranids, in my opinion. The signature unit lets you strengthen your command substantially, and the signature event is incredibly good. It's basically Archon's Terror. It has a slightly different condition. Instead of it being a non-unique unit, it has to be a unit with cost equal to or lower than the number of Tyranid cards you have at the planet, or Tyranid units, rather. But because you make all those free units, and you tend to amass a large force with the Swarmlord, the indescribable horror's disadvantage is often mitigated. Like, I've been in situations where I've been able to play it even on units like the Black Legion Helldrake, which are as expensive as it gets.
Right.
And that really helps Tyranids. I think Tyranids are slightly lacking in terms of combat tricks. It's not horrible, but it's not great. And having that card really helps a lot there. Additionally, sometimes Tyranids can have trouble with very big enemy units or like AoE type units. Tyranids kind of tend to amass a horde and have a large number of relatively lower cost units, and their elites have like very strong abilities against other smaller units, but aren't necessarily very efficient against enemy big units. So sometimes if someone's going to put down like a Firedrake Terminator, for instance, that can be a big problem. But the indescribable horror lets you deal with those units when you need to. Similarly, if Aon Shi is coming, if Aon Shi is showing up and putting gun drones on a marksman or something, you can send him off the field before that has a chance to go off.
Well, definitely. I suppose taking all of that into consideration, are there any specific matchups, whether it's based on Warlord or faction, that the Swarmlord really manages to excel against?
Yeah, I think that, broadly speaking, I think that the Swarmlord is very strong against decks that are reliant on supports, because Clogged with Corpses is so good, and we really haven't seen that much anti-support stuff before, but it really plays a big role.
Sure.
In games where, you're playing against Aon Shi and you destroy his orbital city, especially if you destroy it during the combat phase after he's already made his commitment and made his plan for the turn's battles based on having that city, that can be a huge blow. I think similarly, Kotias, for instance, is often pretty reliant on cards like Ketachan Outpost and Staging Ground, and destroying those can be very rough. And, that's to say nothing of the general utility of being able to pick off people's signature supports and stuff. But I think that I think he's good against decks with supports, and I think he's very good against decks that don't have a way of handling a large number of units. Most notably, Eldar and Dark Eldar both really lack strong counters to swarms, and for that reason, the Swarmlord has a relatively strong matchup there.
Right, and they're definitely very prominent within the competitive scene as well. And
Yeah.
I can't help but think, just as you alluded to earlier, that support destruction having been so rare, Astra Militarum and Tau faction players probably are pretty used to, once they play a support, it remaining in play. So it just kind of, I would imagine, provides a unique disadvantage to them that they're not used to having to go up against. Something I was kind of curious about, seeing as how our Tyranid faction have 5 different Synapse unit options out of the gate. Presuming you've probably dabbled with each of them, what are your initial thoughts regarding your preferences?
Yeah, so I've played a little bit. I haven't played very much with a few of the Synapse units, but I have played a little bit with all of them, I believe. And right now I'm all about the Stalking Lictor. I think the Stalking Lictor is an extremely good unit, and it's all about, again, like kind of shoring up the weaknesses that you have. So the Tyranids, if you can get into the late game, the Swarmlord's completely amazing. But he has some difficulty sometimes in getting over the initial hump of starting with 6 cards and 6 resources,
Right.
and not having access to as many efficient command units as most other factions. So in light of that, I've chosen a Synapse unit that has 2 command icons and is basically going to give me another command snipe every turn, unless the opponent can go over there and deal with it somehow. And because of that, I have kind of shored up the Tyranid weakness in early command and given me a more reliable method of transitioning into the late game. Once you get into the late game, the Lictor's kind of relevant, but not that relevant compared to some of the other Synapse units. But in my experience, I don't typically need very much help with the late game. Where I need help is in like getting over the early command hump, and the Lictor is great for doing that. So it's currently my Synapse of choice. One interesting thing is that I think a lot of people have thought that the Gravid Turvagon was an obvious choice for the Swarmlord, just looking at the previews of the cards.
Sure.
But I've actually found it to be somewhat limited in that Broadly speaking, if you're running a deck that makes a bunch of Termagants and has a bunch of Hive Mind type stuff, you very frequently hit the token limit even without the Gravid Turbigon. And because of that, you're actually kind of hitting a there's quite diminishing returns from a lot of cards once you're at the token limit.
Definitely.
Spawn Termagants, for instance, is completely useless, and Termagant Horde provides only like a backup replenishment capacity instead of actively growing your army. And for that reason, I've actually shied away from the Gravid Turbigon, even in very Hive Mind-focused decks.
Well, I can certainly see that. I mean, I think any deck really wants to avoid unnecessary redundancy, and just to make sure you can always get the utmost value out of each and every card, just because if you'd like to trigger the Swarmlord or Gravid Turbigon's reaction, and you can't actually really benefit from doing that, or you can't derive the full benefit, then that just kind of sucks, and you'd be much better off picking a different Synapse unit. What about something like the Savage Warrior Prime for the Swarmlord, where you're not necessarily winning command, but you're still activating battle abilities?
Yeah, the Savage Warrior Prime is definitely my second favorite of the Synapse units, and it plays very differently to the Stalking Lictor. I mean, I feel like you could almost record an entire video for each of the Synapse units because the way that they play is so different and like lends so much nuance to the way the Tyranids work overall.
Sure.
But broadly speaking, what the Savage Warrior Prime lets you do is pick off units, often command capping units. You can kill them and then trigger the battle ability there. You're not going to win the command, but you're going to pick them off for next turn and then hopefully get a good battle ability as well. And additionally, you can send him to the first planet if you want to like shore up the battle there. He has like pretty good combat stats. And I think that I think in some matchups he's incredibly good, but I think that in other matchups he's not as good. And I think all the Synapse creatures provide effects that are quite strong, and it's really a matter of selecting which one you think is the best. So I think the Savage Warrior Prime is very good, but you'd have to start playing cards like Fall Back to try to provide some more protection for him in case, you know, Space Marines are going to drop pod him when he's out there trying to pick somebody off. And for that reason, I prefer the Stalking Lictor, which I think needs a little less support from the rest of the deck and has an effect that is slightly more oriented towards plugging a hole that I see in the typical Tyranid game plan. That said, the Savage Warrior Prime is certainly very strong. I mean, I think they're both amazing cards.
Well, certainly. I suppose transitioning ever so slowly into the realm of the Swarmlord's weaknesses, how do you try and strike a balance between which and how many different hive mind specialization units to include when you are building a Tyranid deck?
Yeah, so I currently have two different types of Swarmlord deck build. So one type has a fair number of hive mind units. I usually don't take everything. But I usually, if I'm going for a Hive Mind focus, I usually take the Strangler Broods and the Swarm Guard, the ones that just provide straight stats.
Right.
And I tend to shun the Termagant Spikers and the Biovore, though I've heard from other players that those units can be effective. The reason for that is I want to fit in other things like command units, just like efficient normal stuff, and Termagant Hordes, which I think are very strong if you're playing a Hive Mind-centric deck. In the other type of deck, I actually don't run any Hive Mind units at all. And that's the type of deck that I've been playing more recently, and I'm not sure which is stronger, but I kind of like the no Hive Mind approach better in a way. And this might seem very strange because the Hive Mind units have very obvious synergy with the things that the Swarmlord is doing.
Sure.
The no Hive Mind approach makes it so that you have more card slots to spend on things like Infestation, and furthermore, it gives you a less crazy matchup against Chaos in particular. So I've been a fair advocate of Chaos for some time. I've always said that Chaos is like on the cusp of being tier 1.
Certainly.
And I think that if these Swarmlord decks become very prevalent with Hive Mind and so on, Chaos is the natural counter that people will look to. Because you have the Gleeful Plague Beast, for instance, you can have any number of Termagants and they will all be wiped by the Gleeful Plague Beast, unless you have a lot of support elements as well. But then Chaos also has the direct damage to focus on those support elements and try to pick them off. So, in order to create greater resiliency against Chaos and against AoE attacks in general, I've started playing around with a version where the late game is provided just by normal Termagants not necessarily being buffed by anything, but then also with the heavy elite unit Shrieking Harpy, which is a totally crazy unit.
Sure.
And that version of the deck also has the benefit of running fewer cards that are kind of combo sensitive, which is to say that if a Strangler Brute is, 1 for a 1/2 with no icon, that's very bad. And it does buff other Termagants, but if you don't have other Termagants there, this unit is extremely inefficient. So it's kind of combo sensitive, and also to an extent telegraphs where you're going to send your Warlord in order to make the Termagants of that location and so on. So I think the no Hive Mind version is the one that I've been playing more recently, and I think its late game is somewhat weaker, except against Chaos. But I feel like it's also less combo sensitive, and you don't have to rely so much on getting the right combinations of cards in order to be effective. You can just kind of start throwing down cards and playing right out the gate.
Well, it certainly strikes me as kind of an answer to the anticipated anti-meta. Like if a lot of players are expecting the Swarmlord to be running all of this hive mind stuff, you're like one step ahead in that you're answering what you think they're going to be answering your initial attempt with. I suppose something I'm curious about is when you are using those hive mind specialization units, how do you try to get the utmost value out of them? Like in regard to deployment, in regard to saving them in your hand?
Yeah, so I think the thing that I normally try to do, the downside of the hive mind units is that their stats are extremely bad for their price.
Right.
Which is to say that usually these are units that don't have command icons. They have bad attack values, though often like fairly high defense values, which is, useful when you have those Termagants out because it means that it's going to be harder for them to pick out your linchpins. But by the same token, it means that they're pretty bad on their own. So, aside from the Swarm Guard, which is 3 for a 1 icon, 1/5, and is therefore not completely bad on its own, I tend to withhold the Hive Mind units and try to play them only in scenarios where I know there's going to be an important fight, so that I don't unnecessarily play units that have no real purpose in the command struggle and weaken my position later.
Sure, and then that just, I suppose, makes it all the less likely that they'll be picked apart by your opponent before you need them.
Yeah, and one good thing is if those units end up being with your Warlord in HQ, you can bring them to whatever battle you want.
Most definitely.
So if you put down a bunch of that stuff on an early planet and then win that planet, you're ready to go. You're ready to go to the next planet and already have quite an investment there.
Sure. Well, we've already touched on a number of weaknesses with the Swarmlord, particularly the susceptibility to so many different chaos cards and effects, but any other significant, vulnerabilities that have really stood out?
Other vulnerabilities. This is not well known, but hive mind units only work while you're at a planet, and an HQ isn't a planet. So if you have a bunch of damaged Termagant tokens that go back to HQ along with a Swarm Guard, the bonus HP wears off and they all die.
Right.
This means that while the Swarm Guard is a very good solution, the Swarm Guard is an extremely strong unit, but it doesn't, if someone gets off an AoE, even if it's only an AoE 1, they're still going to wipe all your Termagant tokens once you get back, so that's kind of bad. In general, AoE type stuff is pretty dangerous to the Tyranid game plan. One other weakness is that the Tyranids don't have that many combat tricks. In particular, they don't have any way to make new units in the middle of a battle, which a lot of other factions do. You can get around that with the amazing Hunter Gargoyles, which are just a completely nuts good unit, as long as you can get the core planets infested.
Sure. I mean, they're like a miniature Wild Rider squadron in a sense.
Yeah, so the way I like to think of them is actually that you're paying 1 for a Chimera token with its own Chimera Den built in.
Right.
Which is extremely strong, especially because you can move them individually and don't have to move them all at once. The downside is that you have to be running the Infest synergy to support it, which is actually the other reason that I've been shying away from the Hive Mind things and just cramming more Infest cards in there. I feel like with the Infest cards enabling the Hunter Gargoyles and the Shrieking Harpy, you end up in a scenario where you can just put down these ridiculously powerful units. and have their effects they can just really wreck people in the right situations.
Well, certainly. I suppose, are there any, say, matchups that instead of, doing particularly well, the Swarmlord really suffers against? So apart from Chaos, apart from, say, a Space Marine player that manages to get into play a bunch of Fire Drake Terminators or something like that, any particular cards really ruin your day?
I think that I think that an Eldar deck that like figures out some way to counter a large number of units, whether that be the new Eldar unique unit or some other thing, is pretty frightening because both Eldar Warlords at this phase have the ability to move after you've committed. In Baharat's case with mobile, and in Eldorath's case with his signature event.
Right.
And doing this gives you a better chance of picking off someone's Synapse unit if it's out there trying to cap something on the backfield. And additionally means that they have a better ability to engage with you when you're trying to... A common thing that the Swarmlord does is he tries to... go next to the planet where the key fight is so that he makes that free Gant at that and then snipes the planet next to it. But being able to move lets you counter that snipe if necessary. The other thing is that I think Cato Sicarius, always a very strong warlord, I think that he has a relative advantage over Ragnar, and I think he has a general advantage over the Swarmlord probably because he has the Space Marines in general are quite annoying if you are using the Savage Warrior Prime because their ability to put down new units in the middle of a battle means that the Synapse is never really safe, even if you're picking off like a humble rogue trader or whatever. They could play Eagle Recruit or Drop Pod Assault, and then even worse, they could play Fury of Sicarius and kill your Synapse unit in one hit.
Right.
And furthermore, Cato's ability with the free resources means that often in those situations where you're getting a free Termagant that's maybe it's just gonna die, but it's gonna just get a hit in against another warlord. Against Cato, that suddenly doesn't look like so good a deal because you're trading one hit for one resource in a lot of cases, which is usually not a good trade.
Well, most definitely. It just seems like everything that Captain Cato Sicarius can bring to bear is almost specifically designed to oppose the Swarmlord. Even the new Space Marine unique, Veteran Barbarous, he could enter play and just really deal out a significant bit of damage to a Synapse unit.
Yeah.
But just kind of looking at things from the onset of a game, as a Tyranid player, particularly one running the Swarmlord with your Stalking Lictor, you mentioned before that you try to push toward the late game, where you're probably the most effective, the most powerful. How do you try to ensure that you do manage to make it that long?
Yeah, so most of my early commits are going to be focused not on like big fights necessarily, but on sniping commands and on spawning Termagants in positions where they're going to be annoying for the opponent later. And because of that, I try to quickly get in a position where I have a resource advantage, and then once I have a resource advantage, I can start throwing down, the Hunter Gargoyles. I don't have to like spend all my resources on command. I can throw down the units that are going to boost me in combat. I can start putting regeneration on guys. I can, even put down the Shrieking Harpy if I want to.
Sure.
But so what I usually do is I try to focus away from the first planets under normal circumstances, and instead spend my commits both from the Warlord and the Lictor on sniping enemy commands and getting into a position where I'm going to have the resource and card advantage. One of my favorite moves with the Swarmlord is to try to get it so the opponent is winning command on the second planet, and then send the Swarmlord to the second planet, sniping their command and also reinforcing the first planet with a Termagant, as well as setting up a Termagant on the third planet that they'll have to deal with later.
Definitely.
So I try to arrange the way that I deploy my own units to encourage them to capture the second planet with some, small unit that I'm going to be able to snipe. And similarly, I try to get into situations where the opponent has at least somewhere on the board a unit or a situation where they're only winning command by one icon, so the Lictor can jump on that and reverse the situation, granting a command win for me instead of for them.
Sure. And that's, the absolute ideal situation where you're getting the real utmost use out of those two command icons.
Yeah.
I suppose just taking the Warlord as a whole, taking a look at the Tyranid faction, what are some of your absolute favorite cards that have risen to the surface, or some of your favorite combos between two synergistic effects?
Yeah, I extremely like Shrieking Harpy. Shrieking Harpy costs 6. It's a 2-icon 2/5, which sounds really bad for 6 resources, but it has flying, which makes it much more resilient.
Right.
And then further, it has an ability which is, I think, maybe unprecedented in terms of overall strength. It's like, after this unit, or when this unit's declared as an attacker, exhaust all enemy non-elite, non-warlord units of this planet. And that's just like bogglingly good. If you have the initiative and the opponent doesn't have elites or warlords that can threaten your harpy, you can defeat a infinite amount of units.
Right. I mean, it's absolutely absurd, and unless they happen to have something like an Archon's Terror,
Yeah.
then there's no real simple solution.
Yeah, and you're vulnerable to the normal counters to elite units, but honestly, I think that's fair because in the situation where they don't have some big counter, you're just going to go completely nuts. I've had games that I had no business winning where the opponent had, 10 units there and I had 1 or 2. But because of that Harpy, almost all their units were basically not in play for the for the battle until they could kill the Harpy, which they often couldn't. Because let's be real, right now almost no one runs any flying units at all.
Right.
The only flying unit that I see with any regularity is Hellion Gang, which is also a small unit, and sometimes, very rarely, I see the Assault Valkyrie, which is actually a pretty good counter to the Shrieking Harpy, except that it isn't elite, so it gets exhausted too.
Certainly.
And so flying units are very rare, and the only ones that people play right now aren't elite. Sometimes I see a Helldrake. And elite units are also very rare. So, under normal circumstances, the opponent doesn't have any units that are strong counters to the Harpy. And additionally, the Harpy's ability is going to exhaust more or less their entire army. And that's just incredibly good.
It certainly is, and just being so enormously durable, even if you don't happen to possess the initiative token, you're likely to live long enough to trigger that exhausting volley at least once. Or
Yeah.
if your opponent has their army showing up exhausted alongside their warlord, you can kind of establish a really nasty initial foothold. So, incredibly powerful unit.
Yeah, and one other thing, you were talking about combos. So one common way to deal with elite units or other big units is to exhaust them. We see this with Eldrath Starbane as one of the main reasons he's so good, and also with the card Suppressive Fire, which I've been seeing more and more of recently.
Sure.
Tyranids don't have too many combat tricks, but they have one trick that's great for that exact situation, which is Dark Cunning.
Right.
And that's you pay 2 to ready a non-warlord unit you control. And then furthermore, if the planet is infested, you gain one of those resources back. So that has a really extremely good synergy with the Harpy. If someone, thinks they can get around it by exhausting you and then attacking you and hopefully burying you under weight of numbers before you can stand up and exhaust their stuff, you can stand yourself right back up with that Dark Cunning. And because they both have a bonus for infested planets, it encourages you for doing it. It rewards you for doing something you already want to do. The other trick that I've pulled off with that, which people haven't seen coming and which has been very strong, is the Harpy is in HQ after winning a different battle, and I go to the planet with my Warlord, bringing the Harpy with me, and they're like, okay, it's exhausted. I have a chance to pick it off. But then I play Dark Cunning, ready it up, and am able to exhaust their stuff instead.
Sure.
So those two cards work really well together, in my opinion. If you are playing Old One-Eye, also, the Old One-Eye's signature support is great for this as well.
Right. The Awakening Cavern certainly
Yeah.
is a very convenient means of, readying any unit that you'd like in that situation.
Yeah, so that Shrieking Harpy has been a standout card. Regeneration has been a standout card, just really effective. Volatile Pyrovore is a great combat unit. Hunter Gargoyles is a great combat unit. And then one card that I didn't rate too highly at first, but that I now think is quite good, was the Spore Sacks, which are 2 for 0/1 with 1 icon, which seems horrible. but then it has combat action, sacrifice this unit to infest this planet and deal 1 damage to each enemy unit there.
Right.
And that action is not all that good normally because, so it's like, if you compare it to, let's say, Tactical Squad Cardenas, which to be fair is one of the best 2-cost units in the game, it's like, well, so my stats are way worse, and I can essentially AoE them as an action, which is really good, but to do it I have to die.
Right.
Whereas the Tactical Squad can do that as its normal attack, doesn't have to die, and then I can play Crushing Blow and stuff like that. There's a bunch of Space Marine synergy that it's great with. But the Spore Sacks are a very good way to infest in a way that's harder for the opponent to deal with, because you can infest the planet with them during the battle, which kind of precludes their chance of removing it before the battle. And one disadvantage, the other infest cards that are commonly played infest the planet. The Hormagaunts infest the planet when you deploy them, and the Venomthrope infest the planet when you win command there. But one disadvantage of those things is the opponent can head to that planet later and remove the infestation.
Well, certainly. I suppose one card I was curious about, just because we're on the subject of the Swarmlord, and the obvious synergy here is that hive mind specialization. What are your thoughts? What's your opinion regarding the mycetic spores? 2-cost support, combat action, exhaust it to move a hive mind specialization unit to a planet that happens to possess a Termagant token.
Yeah, I don't play that card even in my hive mind focused deck. I don't like it very much. I think that I think you de facto already have a way to move your hive mind units to the next important planet, which is when there's going to be that big battle, you send your warlord there, you win the big battle, now they're back in HQ, and now they go with your warlord to the next planet. There are relatively few situations where I have a large enough build-up of Termagants on multiple planets that are going to have battles on the same turn that I would need to use the spores. And yeah, that's basically my thought on that card. It's conceivable that the card will be better in the future, or would be better if you were loading up some upgrades onto your hive mind units themselves.
Right.
But right now, every hive mind unit we've seen is like very inefficient for its cost at actually fighting. So it's only really good in scenarios where you're using it for its hive mind effect. And I think the number of times when you're going to find yourself in a scenario where you want to use a hive mind unit for its hive mind effect at multiple battles in the same turn are very low. And I think most of the time you're going to be wanting to deploy those units on Planet 1 before a big battle there. And then since it's Planet 1, you're going to be able to move them with your warlords. So I don't rate that card too highly. I also don't like the Swarmlord signature support very much, the one that lets you put hive mind units back in play.
Right.
It has... So you might think this is really good with Swarmguard because Swarmguard's already hard to kill, and then when they kill it, you can put it back into play. And that's kind of good, except that during the time where it's been killed but hasn't been brought back into play, all your Termagants just died if they had damage on them because the effect went away.
Exactly.
So that's really not so good. It is cool when they kill your Brood Warriors and then you just send them down the line to cap command elsewhere. That's a very strong play. But I'm not super happy with that card overall. I don't play it very frequently in my non-Hive Mind deck, and in the Hive Mind focused deck, while I do play it when I get the chance, I'm never incredibly happy about it.
Well, and it's certainly a bit of a deterrent in that it costs 3 resources.
Yeah.
So, another card I was kind of curious about before we move on is the Bone Sabers. So, you get an attack boost to your Warlord. After you destroy an army unit with an attack, you generate a Termagant token. Do you typically use that as shields, or more for its conventional effect?
Yes, that depends on situational factors. It's really good on your Warlord. But at the same time, you only have 6 HP, and Tyranids don't have that many other shield cards, so you really want to consider using it to shield as well. In my experience, it's better on the Warlord.
Okay.
If you can get it out, because it can really have a mean effect, especially when paired with No Mercy, which is a card that I think most Tyranid decks should be running, since your Synapse is unique,
Right.
And you have the ability to play No Mercy basically from the get-go. I've had a lot of situations where I've been able to use my Synapse to play No Mercy, to ensure that my Warlord with the Bone Sabers just killed a 3 HP unit in one hit, and I got a free unit out of it. That's a very good combination. But that said, there are going to be those times when you just really need those shields, and you got to keep it in your hand.
Sure, and I mean, if you've got a preference for the Stalking Lictor, it's all but guaranteed that it's going to be ready in order to trigger that No Mercy.
Yeah.
So just seems like a potentially fantastic effect. But just because this does strike me as one of the more complicated warlords for someone like a newer player to play, and since you yourself happen to mention that the Great Devourer is kind of a beginner-friendly product, what might be some good basic advice, like where to start if you're really trying to get this warlord to function but maybe struggling?
Yeah, let me think about that one for a second. Yeah, so I think I think we kind of touched on this earlier. When you first come to the Tyranids, I would advocate making a deck that just has a lot of different units that you're interested in and kind of testing those things out. I think that one thing that's going to be very important to know is that you don't have to make Gants if you don't want to. There's two situations where this is important, but it's sometimes really important. One is if you are going to give Kato a free resource for killing your Gant, you don't have to make it. The other one is if they're going to win Taurus, you can just not make the Gants and therefore have fewer units so they aren't going to be able to trigger that effect.
Right.
I think that's a very, very strong play that a lot of people don't see. Another piece of advice would be that I think this is kind of true for everyone, but it's especially true for the Tyranids, given that you start out usually a little bit on the back foot when it comes to what all you're going to be able to play on the first turn. You don't have to win every planet. The Swarmlord is probably the warlord where I commit to planet 1 the least of any warlord. And because committing to planet 1 with the Swarmlord means that you are not getting an extra token, because there isn't a planet 0 that you can spawn a token on. There's only one adjacent planet to planet 1. And I think that it's quite important for a newcomer. I've seen a lot of new players fixate too much on winning battles and kind of lose the long game.
Right.
And I think with the Tyranids, that's especially important. I think that probably less than 20% of my commits are to Planet 1 with the Swarmlord, which really means a lot if you consider that, that would be less than just completely randomly selecting a planet. And normally people are committing much more than that to Planet 1.
Right.
I think that generally speaking, the best advice that I could give to new people would be when you're playing the Swarmlord, kind of build up your stuff, bide your time, only fight if it's important, either for you to win or to prevent your opponent from winning. And then once you've secured the command advantage and you're building up your forces, that's when you start going to Planet 1 and like kind of stockpiling your combat units there and so on.
Sure. Well, certainly as we touched on earlier when we took a glance at Paul Steiner's games results statistical database, it seems as though initially the Swarmlord is quite competitive, but over the long term, perhaps next year at the North American Championships or in quite a while from now, once players adjust the meta to accommodate the Tyranids, do you view him as being kind of a long-term competitive warlord?
Yeah, I mean, so that's very hard to tell. I mean, it's always hard to tell how strong something's going to be just based on early results.
Sure.
I do think the Swarmlord is going to be viewed as competitive in the long run. I think that the Swarmlord is probably on the top tier, and I think that if he's not, he's probably on tier 1.5 at least. Which is to say that, like, so right now the uncontroversial top tier is Kato, Ragnar, Kith, and Eldorath. And I think that I would personally add Zerathur. Some people would add Aon Shi. I wouldn't, but some people would. But I think that of those, the Swarmlord has a somewhat bad matchup against Kato, but has quite a good matchup against Kith and Eldorath, and has a relatively good matchup against Ragnar simply because the way that your ability works means that you're less likely to be committing to the same planet as him, even if you want to contest that planet in a fight.
Right.
And so for that reason, if we're looking at the top tier warlords and we're saying here's a warlord that seems to have an advantage against most of the top tier, that strikes me as someone who's going to have a pretty high competitive potential. Also, just like my general feel for it is that a lot of the interactions and things that you're doing with the Tyranids are very strong. We're going to have to wait. We're going to have to see how this stacks up in the big tournaments and stuff like that. But I definitely think Swarmlord is a serious contender, even just with the card pool available in the Great Devourer.
Well, most definitely, and by no means can I fault any of your logic there, but in kind of drawing this video slowly to a close, what are some of your just favorite experiences, some of your favorite memories piloting the Swarmlord? So if there are new Tyranid players out there, what are some exciting things you've had happen that would maybe motivate or inspire someone to give our Tyranids a chance?
Yeah, oh man, there's so many cool things and interactions with the Tyranids. It's hard to just select a few. I think one thing I've had that's been really cool is I had a regenerating Termagant horde with regeneration on it that probably got me, I think, 6 or 7 Termagant tokens over the course of the game.
Wow.
So that's just huge value, and it just really drives home the like overall theme of the hordes and hordes of Tyranids kind of rolling over the opposition. I've had I've had my a Shrieking Harpy plus I think one other unit and my Warlord defeat an army of like 10 units plus their Warlord because I had the initiative and was just exhausting them every time. I've had I've had so many Hive Mind units at a planet that each of my Termagant tokens is a 3/7.
Dear God.
Yeah, that was pretty brutal. I had all 3 Stormguard and 2 Strangler Broods at one planet. I additionally had a Termagant horde, so I was making a new Termagant every turn, and I had the Bone Sabers, so whenever my Warlord killed someone, I got another Termagant. Needless to say, I won that game. Um,
I would hope so.
yeah, I've had games where I've pulled off combos to surprisingly infest planets. I had one where I sacrificed a Spore Sack unnecessarily on an empty planet next to the planet where we were fighting, and then played Predation to infest that planet since it was now next to an infested planet.
Sure.
And then I was able to use a Harpy to exhaust everyone and win. I've had the Hunter Gargoyle mass in the late game make it so that the opponent basically couldn't go anywhere safely because the gargoyles would just jump on them and eat their warlord wherever they went. I've had a lot of fun playing the Tyranids. I think they're one of the most fun factions to play as. I think if you're familiar with the Warhammer 40K background, they did a great job of translating it to the game. There's a lot of just like extremely fun, extremely characterful interactions, and it really does feel like you're kind of the swarm. The swarm is building up and washing over the sector.
Well, sure. And as someone who, really started playing the game because the Tyranids were announced, someone with the gall to call themselves the Hive Tyrant, by no means have I been disappointed so far with what I've seen. So I've yet to play them much myself, but it just seems like an enormous bit of fun. And I'm, as with any faction, just excited to see what else is going to come down the pipeline. But just as a means of drawing things to a close, just to touch on some of the Swarmlords, weaknesses once again. If someone is really, really struggling to overcome some of their local meta, someone playing the Swarmlord and just consistently crushing them, is there any advice you could give a player to try and overcome one of our Tyranid warlords?
Yeah, you need to deal effectively with the Swarmlord, even if they're using the build where they're not playing Hive Mind units, they're still going to have a lot of guys. So you need to have a way to deal with massed units effectively. The best way to do this is with Area of Effect, but not all armies have good access to this. So another option would be cards like Warp Storm, which deal damage across a large group, or cards like Fire Drake Terminators or the new Solarite Avitus. I don't know how to pronounce that, but we're going to call it Solarite Avitus.
Sure.
Where they deal damage back to units attacking them and therefore are able to disperse a large number of units by themselves. This sort of like mass, the sort of Area of Effect, like, mass control is pretty important. And for that reason, I would suggest that if possible, you put in more area effect units in your deck. If you're playing Tau, you should really be playing 3 gun drones, and you should seriously consider saving those, even if it seems important to play them as a unit, so that you have them as an attachment in the key situation. If you're playing the Marines, I think it may be time for Daring Assault Squad to make a comeback. That's a card that we haven't seen in a long time, but to me, it seems like it's still. Like it may be time to bring it back if these Tyranid decks are getting popular. Similarly, the Fire Drake Terminators are a great one to put in there. If you're playing Dark Eldar, I think this is now at the time when you need to seriously consider switching from the Eldar Alliance to the Chaos Alliance, which is going to hurt your matchups against a lot of decks, but that Warp Storm is actually going to be pretty important in the right circumstances. If you're more interested in opposing them with any deck that you want rather than tuning an existing deck, I would advocate playing Kato or playing Chaos. I think that Kato's ability to gain resources lets you kind of take advantage of the Swarmlord's slowly building and relatively weak individual units in order to harvest the resources that you need to bring out cards like those Fire Drake Terminators and contest them in the late game. Whereas I think that Chaos has the best area effect, mass damage, targeted damage type effects in the game, which gives you the best ability to deal with a large number of units or to pick out those linchpin hive mind units and debuff a bunch of the termagants that they were counting on to be strong.
Well, certainly. And I suppose just as a closing piece here, any final thoughts or words of wisdom for the audience?
Yeah, so I just checked on, this is actually pretty ridiculous. I just checked on the database that Paul Steiner set up, and during the conversation that we've been having, it looks like some more results have been submitted, and the if I'm reading this correctly, the Swarmlord has jumped from being the number 3 warlord on the database to being the number 2 warlord on the database in terms of win rates. So, it's building even as we speak.
Sure.
But yeah, I'd just like to say I think the Great Devourer is an excellent deluxe expansion. I really look forward to the general release of it so that more people can get their hands on it. I think it's one of the most exciting. I think it's the most exciting expansion I've seen for Conquest, and probably the most exciting expansion I've seen in any of the LCGs that I've played. I really recommend that people pick it up. I think it's great stuff.
Well, I certainly can't disagree with you there. I'm looking forward to eventually picking it up myself. Just because I'd not had the opportunity to speak to you since the championship, I just want to say congratulations once again on your stellar showing at Gen Con.
Thanks.
And I suppose, with that said, thank you once again, Davis, for making a return appearance. And unless there are any anti-shoutouts you want to give, or maybe get in some more pot shots at superiority, I suppose we'll call it here.
All right. Well, you mentioned superiority. I'm just going to point out one more Tyranid interaction. The Brood Warriors give command icons to the Termagant tokens, not to them themselves.
Right.
So a lot of people are saying, oh, you can think of this as a 2-cost, 2-icon unit if there's a Termagant there. But it's actually better than that because it spreads out the icons. So if someone didn't listen to my previous shout-out and put superiority into their deck, playing superiority on the Brood Warriors doesn't prevent the Termagant tokens from having command icons, so it really doesn't get you as much as you might think.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, I can never resist getting digs in against superiority.
Well, it's great. And, the same can be said for Eldorath himself. He's only exhausting maybe one command icon as opposed to 2 or more.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I guess one other shout out, No Mercy. No Mercy is a card that I think a lot of people haven't been playing so much. I think it was prevalent earlier in the game's life, but has kind of fallen off as the factions get more cards in the initial cycle. Playing with Tyranids has caused me to play No Mercy more frequently because you always have another unique with your Synapse from the start of the game. And I have to say, it's been doing really well for me, and I would honestly suggest that you put it into more decks than just Tyranid ones. I think that one of the more unusual effects of the Tyranids on the metagame might be that it will lead to kind of a renaissance of No Mercy as people see that card and start to realize that it can be quite good in other decks.
Yeah.
So yeah, shout out to the Great Devourer box. It's a great box. Another anti-shout out to Superiority, and shout out to No Mercy.
Well, I mean, even myself, I've seen a No Mercy used to fantastic effect to take out an Autarch Salakia that had activated its ability.
Nice.
Been shifted away from a planet. The player wasted a 2 shield card, and then it was all in vain. So, pretty fantastic value there. But, as always, thank you once again, Davis, and have a fantastic evening.
You too. Thanks again.
Well, with our interview having ultimately drawn to a close, I'll just conclude this video by saying thank you once again for watching. Be sure to leave a comment sharing your own thoughts, opinion, experience, or pure speculation when it comes to not just the Swarmlord, but the Tyranid faction as a whole. Interacting with viewers like you is the absolute highlight of creating content for this channel, so please take a moment to let me know what you thought of this interview and which warlord, what content you'd like to see next. If you know someone that would make a good candidate to guest star in a future video, I encourage you to share. But with that said, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you've not done so already. If you are already subscribed, I ask that you share this content, as the more eyes there are on these videos, the more potential new players we might draw to this game, and as a result serve only to ever expand our growing Conquest community. Please feel free to contact me directly and keep in touch through any form of social media that you'd like, but in any case, thank you once again for watching, and be sure to check back in again soon for ever more Conquest LCG content to come.